Hi everybody, this is Amy Mesney from Amy Mesney's Teaching Ideas for You. I'm happy to have you here today. Today is day 4 of our Mastery Grading Live series. The first day we just talked about a quick overview of what Mastery Grading was. The second day we went into what is scoring versus grading. Yesterday we talked about directed learning versus facilitated learning. And today we're going to talk about how using Mastery Grading makes it easier for teachers to differentiate their lessons for students. So let's do a quick recap about what we've talked about. Mastery grading, the goal is for students to master the objectives. It's all focused on student mastery of learning goals. So the way mastery grading is set up to do that is it focuses on encouraging engagement. So if you can get the students engaged, you should be see an increase in their achievement because they're actually participating and trying and learning the work. So scoring versus grading helps to encourage students to try because it lowers their risk in failing. So if you'd like to learn more about scoring versus grading, please look back to that live that we did the other day. And then we also talked about how if you do a mixture of directed learning and facilitated learning, that also increases kids' engagement because they're having to take ownership of their learning. So how does mastery grading make differentiation easier? That's our question. But the first thing that we want to do is, instead of focusing on how we're going to differentiate, we really want to start with increasing engagement, because until the students are engaged, you can differentiate all you want to. If they don't do the work, if they don't participate, they're not going to achieve. So I broke this down into the 3 Ps. So the 3 Ps that are things that we want students to do, and that if they do them, it should affect their achievement and help them become higher achievers. So the 3 Ps are pay attention, participate, and practice. So in order to get them to do those 3 things, we really need to take some of the risk away of them failing. Especially your middle school and high school students, they don't want to look dumb in front of their friends. They don't want to feel dumb, even if nobody is thinking that. It's like I always tell kids, if you have a question, ask it, because there's probably 5 or 6 other people with the same question that just aren't asking it. But you have to build that into your classroom culture, that it's okay to take a risk. So that's the most important thing at the beginning of the year. Focus on those 3 Ps and focus on showing kids that it is okay to take those risks, and eventually that those risks are going to pay off, because that's the trick. The kids have to see that doing those things is actually going to get them somewhere. Otherwise it's why practice, right? Why practice? I'm not going to do well anyway. So if you can show them over time, you actually get student buy-in. Some kids will buy in really fast. Some kids might take quite a while, and you just have to keep really showing them. You have to show them, well, look, if you've done this and you've done this and you've done this, you're ready for the test. If you've done this and you've done this and you've done this, it's helped you to understand the material better, and we caught what you didn't understand and we fixed it. So focus on that buy-in before you try and worry about differentiation, because the buy-in is going to make the differentiation easier. So another important thing to do before you worry about the differentiation is, I'm calling this your feedback loop or your instruction loop. When you organize your instruction, you want to have your lessons so that you have lesson, practice, feedback, lesson, practice, feedback. And the feedback that you receive might change what you have planned for the next instruction. If you go through a lesson and the students do the practice, and you can see that across the board the kids have misunderstood the concept, you might want to go back and reteach, because if they don't understand that concept, you really can't go to the next concept. And that helps kids to see that, okay, well, I misunderstood that, but we're going to fix it now. And so I'm not going to still be confused by the time we get to the test. And the trick with that feedback is, that's your reward and the students' reward, because they're getting targeted feedback to what they don't understand, and you're going to use their feedback, and their feedback, the student feedback to you, are the questions that they're asking, because that's the differentiation. You know, they're basically, as you drop the risk for students, you're going to get them to be more honest with you about what they need help with. The help is the differentiation that they need. So there's a purpose to it. So mastery grading isn't really complicated. It's just a system. But once the system works, once the wheels are greased, everything ties together and flows in a circle. So this teaching loop, you have the instruction. Again, like we talked about yesterday, that's going to be a mix of direct instruction and various types of facilitated instruction. It could be partner work, it could be group work, group discussion, individual work. Then the students will have their practice. Then you're going to quickly go over that practice. At the end of each practice, it might be the next day, it might be at the end of class, but the students check their own work, because you need the students to start analyzing their own learning. Did I understand it? Did I think I understood it, but I didn't? Ooh, I really still don't understand it and I need more help. Because you need them to be honest and giving you that feedback on what they need. So like we talked about in scoring versus grading, all of this practice you're going to score instead of grade. And scoring, you know, really, again, that is such a helpful and insightful thing to learn. But scoring is basically rewarding the students for their effort, for taking that risk to try the work that they are not sure about yet, instead of grading them and possibly being punished for not really understanding the work. So this feedback loop, once you get kids to buy in, you're going to move to the differentiation. So how do you determine their learning needs? Well, again, as you are having this 10 to 15 minute review of their practice, you're taking note in your mentally, who is really struggling, what kind of questions are being asked, which questions are being asked by a majority of the students or seem to be the problem across a bunch of the kids, because that might need a whole class review. Whereas if you have 2 or 3 students who are really targeting like something that they don't understand, you might want to pull them aside as a small group. So you're taking what they're telling you and you're kind of making mental notes, or if you have a clipboard and you can jot some notes about what possible differentiation you could have during class or during practice, okay? And so you don't want to, of course, point these out, but these are the pain points. These are the students' pain points that they are telling you. Now, the first quarter, you might have a lot of kids who are not telling you things, and that's where, as you walk around and record scores on their practice, you know, I used to kind of glance at their work and see where were they having trouble on the practice, and you can mentally note that way who maybe was having problems but didn't say anything. So until you get the buy-in, you may still have to go back to, you know, figuring out who needs help but who's still not saying. So the differentiating instruction, I know when I went to sessions on differentiating instruction, it seemed really, really overwhelming. Like, I'm going to have these small groups and each group's going to be working on something different. And it was crazy. And I just thought it's like having a circus. Like every ring is going to have something else to do. And it's like, I'm the ringmaster and I've got to juggle all that. I mean, that's great if you can handle it. And I know that there are some, you know, educational programs out there that do that. I tried that and it's just not my style, and I bombed. I found it really difficult for me to do, and it just didn't work for me. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those programs, but every teacher has to have their own style and their own way of doing things, and you have to do what works for you. So my brother and I both use mastery grading, this layout in our classrooms, and so what we talked about was, you know, instead of having every kid do something different, like this group is working on reading and this group over here is writing and this group is doing a center activity, really what you can do to differentiate is everybody is still working on the same objective, the same standard, but you're just differentiating what they're doing. So, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but also remember, I have a student with a 504, my own student, and my brother's his own children are autistic. And we've been shocked at how many teachers have not even looked at the IEP goals or the 504 goals. As teachers, if you have students that have written goals out in an IEP or 504, that you also have to take into consideration with differentiation. So please be aware of that. I always made a note of those things at the beginning of the year, because sometimes you already know the differentiation that they need is in those goals, and you just make it a lot harder when you don't, note them down. So just keep that in mind, that IEPs you do have to pay attention to. But my brother and I did differentiation with two main things, and it's so much easier this way, or at least I found it so much easier. The first thing is to just have collaborative groups. Now, there's different ways you can do collaborative groups. Sometimes as the year has gone on and you've taught students about learning habits and you've talked about what's a good choice in a group work and what's not a good choice, you can let students pick their own groups. Sometimes you do need to pull students aside and say, was this the best group of students for you to work with? How did this go? I know you guys are best friends, but are you best work partners? You do have to teach kids that. It's not, kids always want to go with their best friend. It's not always their best person to work with. So sometimes you can let the students pick, but sometimes you need to pick groups. And your needs-based groups, they're going to be fluid. They're not always going to be the same kids, because kids have different strengths and different things. So it may depend on what you're working on. So, my brother and I said the two main things that we use, especially as social studies, language arts teachers, is we look at reading ability and writing ability. And those are the two ways that we will focus on groups. So if you are looking at a primary document, or you are having kids analyze news articles, you may want to divide them up into your higher readers, your middle readers, your lower readers, but they're still reading on the same objective, and that's the trick. So you've differentiated. The groups are reading different passages or different texts, or maybe they're reading a smaller chunk of a text, but they're not working on something completely different. The same goal is there for every group. So when you're giving directions and you're setting the expectations for this activity, every group is doing the same thing. You're working towards X. If your goal is to understand the main points in the Declaration of Independence, that's going to be the same no matter whether you're giving them the whole document, or maybe you're just giving them an excerpt from the document, or maybe you're giving them an abridged version of the document. Same goal. Because then at the end, they're all able to have a class discussion and do peer feedback. And so because you're not having different documents, or you're not having a different topic for each document necessarily, it's the same goal, you can have those group discussions. One thing to be careful about, because I did this, like when I write passages and I sell them in my store, I include different reading levels. But then you have to remember that not every student read the exact same passage. So you really need to talk about the passage and not try and read pieces of the passage, because then students are like, well, that's not what was in mine. So sometimes it's easier if you are, say, talking about industrialization. This group might be focused on the agricultural advances. This one might be focused on the communication advances. So then you can have a discussion, but it's not as obvious that there were different levels that you handed out. So another way, okay, so we talked about collaborative groups, and I forgot to change my screen. We just talked about differentiating materials. These are the two main ways that we differentiate. We differentiate who gets put together in a group, and we differentiate what materials they might receive to do. And I want to point this out as well, that your differentiation of materials might also be that some students get videos, some students might get an audio, just because like my own children have issues with sensory processing. And so now that I'm homeschooling my son, we've learned that he does a whole lot better if he watches a video. He retains so much more, because we were working on social studies at home and we were using books that were a little bit easier to read, and we were discussing them, and we were even doing worksheets, and I noticed like the next day he wouldn't remember almost anything. But when we switched him to watching videos like John Green videos and things like that, he retains so much more. So don't limit yourself into thinking that Sorry, everybody. I think we're having technical difficulties. We're having a rainstorm, so I think my camera froze up. So I'm going to back up because I'm not sure exactly where I froze. And I was just talking about how not to limit yourself to differentiating only text, but you might differentiate by having students watch videos in the listening center. Some students might be reading a text. Some students might be just listening to something, because depending on processing issues and other problems, students have different issues. So can you hear me now? So I want to make sure I'm up and on. I know I was out. So I want to make sure we're having some technical difficulties today. So then the last thing we want to talk about are summative assessments. So summative assessments can also be differentiated for students. You know, so again, some students might need, according to their IEP, an oral assessment. You know, my son does a lot better when he gets to discuss something with you and tell you what he knows than what he does with, say, multiple choice. You know, but the assessment should still be focused on the objectives. So you need to stay focused with everybody, no matter which way they are, no matter which way you are going to test them, is focused on the same objectives. So just keep that in mind. And the other thing we talked about when we talked about scoring versus grading the other day is that summative assessment should be a one and done. This retesting and oh, can I study again and retest? If your goal for the summative assessment is to find out what the mastery level is that students have achieved, that if they're retaking it and retaking it, you're not really using the assessment to determine their level. So if you're still finding a lot of students are getting to the end of the summative assessment and not doing well, you might need to think about building in more practice as you go, because with mastery grading, your goal is to catch those misconceptions and fix them before you get to the summative assessment. Again, you're going to have some students that won't buy in right away. You almost have to prove it to them. But again, one and done. One and done. You know, if you are an Olympian, you get one chance to run your race. You don't say, oh, wait a minute, I wasn't quite ready, you know, at the block. Can I rerun? No, like you get one shot. You know, this is your test date. You've given them plenty of warning when it's going to be. You've prepared them with the expectation for the test that it's going to be a mix of multiple choice and essay and or whatever it is, so the students know and they've had plenty of head up time to be prepared, you know, then they don't get a second chance. So just keep that in mind, that the goal of your differentiation is not to make you more work. It's to better prepare your students to meet those same mastery objectives. And the summative assessment can be differentiated for students. It might have to be depending on their IEP goals, but it should still be covering the same objectives. You should be able to tell from all of your assessments the level that the student is at, and that is the goal. So I hope this has helped you out with differentiation. I hope it's described how to differentiate in ways that might be a little less complicated. And you have to find the style that works for you. If you are great with making groups and rotating them through different activities and it works for you, then you might want to keep doing things like that. For me, I do stuff like, all right, when I was still in the classroom, I did stuff like that once in a while, but I found that as a continuing routine, it just didn't work for me. But I could easily differentiate what they were working on, but still have them working on the same goal. So that is the end of mastery grading. If you have any questions, my brother and I would be more than happy to help you set this up. If you want to use it in your classroom this year, I found that it just made my planning, it took my planning a little bit deeper, but it made planning easier because I had that feedback loop and I knew what I wanted to do. To help you out, I have standards posters and checklists if you need to keep a data folder for your school, and I have put them on sale for you. I have both Florida standards and I have Common Core standards. These are some of the data folders that I made. So they're all set up like this, whether they're Common Core or FSA. I set them up where I have the standards on a page, and then I have spaces for the kids to mark down their level for that objective. And then there's room for you to come back and reassess so that you can reteach something and kids can continue to work to mastery. It's not a one shot and you're done. So these are called checklists, I CAN checklists. I also use these. Here's the 5th grade one, and you can see that this is set up much the same way. But for the Florida checklist, I have all the Common Core or all the core classes. Whereas for Common Core, of course, it's just the math and language. But I also use these to help me keep track of what I've taught. So I would just make a copy of these and put them in my plan book. And as I taught a lesson on that particular standard, I would mark the date. So I could also put this in my plan book. And when I had to turn my plan book in, it was very easy to show that I had hit the standards. And my brother is leaving me a message. We are going to also have all of these mastery grading topics on the blog. We're just having a technical glitch because I'm moving my blog from Blogger to WordPress, and there's a problem right now that I'm getting fixed with the tech guy. And as soon as that's fixed, we're going to have this up on the blog that you can refer to as well. If you would like posters to put up into your focus wall, you can see them behind me over here. Those are examples of the posters. Again, they're available for both Common Core and FSA. I print them out and I just put them in a binder and I have them to refer to all year long. I just put them up on the wall with push pins and take them down and change them out as needed. It makes it a lot easier than having to write them out every single time. Next week, if you teach social studies, I am going to be talking about how to integrate social studies into, or writing and social studies together, so that it makes it easier and smoother for you to actually have the time to do both. And I'm also going to talk about, if you are a middle school or a high school teacher, what does it mean to teach writing and social studies? What does that look like, and how can you do that without having to be responsible for all of the ELA standards as well? So join me next week to learn more about that, and I hope to see you then. Thank you guys so much for coming today.